It's that time again. The annual conference of the American Society of Ag Consultants, otherwise known as ASAC, is going to be held in Fort Myers, Florida, this November 4th and 5th. Kurt Covington is one of 9 professionals who will address the conference. The other speakers who will cover a wide range of topics represent Florida Farm Bureau, Florida Citrus Commission, University of Tennessee Institute of Agriculture, National Ag Law Center, Risk Mitigators and Advisors, Tyler Associates, as well as the lead economist for dairy at CoBank, and myself, Chrissy Wozniak from North American Ag. The day and a half of presentations will be followed by ag tours on Tuesday afternoon at Echo Farms, one of my favorite places here in Fort Myers. Attendees will experience farming at its most creative, with unique demonstrations, plants, and techniques being used to help farmers and urban gardeners in developing countries. A second tour at Echo will showcase simple technologies that can improve food, water, and shelter for millions of people. A third tour of a hydroponic grower is also being planned. For more information and to register, visit www.agconsultants.org. That's www.agconsultants.org. See you there. And welcome to North American Ag Spotlight. I'm Chrissy Wozniak. My guest today, I am super excited to have him back on the show. He's a 6th-generation farmer, a radio, TV, and podcast host, but most importantly, he's a patriotic warrior for the agriculture industry, for property rights, and for liberty. And for those in the audience that know my story, you know that I moved from Canada to Florida 3 years ago. And what you might not know is that this man right here had a big part in helping me decide to make that biggest move of my life. And I will forever be grateful to his support and all the many phone calls that decision took. For this Ag Spotlight episode, the week before election, I thought that there would be no better guest than to have him on the show and give his thoughts about what lays ahead from now, especially now till January. From Central Nebraska, I'd like to welcome Trent Loos. Welcome, Trent, and thank you so much for your time.
I would give you my time anytime you ask. You just rarely ask, but surely you misspoke. That wasn't 3 years ago when you migrated to Florida, was it?
It was 4 years when I started thinking about it.
Wow.
Time went fast.
It was 2020 when we got together originally, wasn't it?
Yep. Yeah. And you had me
were
on
hiding
your
out in
show
the bunker in a church.
That's right. Yeah. And at the border, remember we live streamed when I was at the border? Yep.
I was going to come see you at the border and then it didn't work out.
Yep. Yeah, that's right.
Well, we're honored to have you here. Thanks for being here and thanks for doing everything that you're doing. I know that you're just traveling the world and you're the real warrior. I just try to identify people like you and truly put them in the spotlight.
Oh, well, thank you. So the main reason you popped into my head this week is RFK. So I know that you have a weird relationship, and I want you to tell that story of how you've gotten to know RFK. And the reason for that is because, you know, in listening to RFK's campaign over the last couple of years, you've, especially and I'm sure you have really seen some of the truth that he's talking about, especially when it comes to health. Well, what is worrying a lot of people in the industry is this activist side of him, which is and could really have disastrous consequences for agriculture. And you know, just the seeing his ad last week of him standing in front of USDA kind of gave me some shivers. So I clearly want Trump to win. I know that would be the best for the country. I'm just a little bit worried, and I think we all are a little bit about, you know, what could this mean? So can you start first with your story about following him around?
So you want the whole story?
Yes.
The whole story dates back to 2002. And I actually, the very first time I had an interaction with Bobby Kennedy was in Northfield, Minnesota at St. Olaf College. A friend of mine from Washington, D.C. called and said, Trent, if you're truly going to be an activist for agriculture, you better go monitor what Bobby Kennedy's doing right now against livestock agriculture. And he is speaking this week at St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota. So, like I do, I hop in my pickup and I head to St. Olaf College. I got there. I was part of the press conference, and Chrissy, this was really one of the first times that I'm in an environment where people are adversarial to agriculture, and in particular modern day agriculture. I had at this point in time, I had just previously started. I started doing this in media work in 1999. And I wanted to tell the story of agriculture. I wanted to make sure that people understood that domestic food and fuel production is a means of national security. I identified some of the great challenges of being the animal rights community because the animal rights community taps into an abundance of wealth, and then they use that money to basically eliminate the ability for us to own animals as property. And at some level, Bobby played into that little realm of people that I was already engaged with anyway in the animal rights community. And so when I got there, I saw this animal rights group plus the environmental group, and they were all like they were on steroids. And then it was in the press conference, which was able to get into because I had media credentials, that I first heard him say, and what is happening on our pig farms today in the United States is causing people to lose humanity. And I've been involved with a pig every day of my life. I've had as high as 2,000 sows. I've had bigger operations. I've managed, or I should say, I provided daily care for 1 million animals in my lifetime at the age of 58. And most of those obviously have been pigs. Then he even talked about the very operation that I was working with in South Dakota, which was a joint venture between the Bell family and the Rosebud Sioux tribe. And I can remember my neck getting red, and I'm just kind of my my temperature elevated. So there was a press conference, and then after the press conference, he was going to the auditorium to address the greater group, which was ultimately about 600 people. And when he finished his press conference, you can imagine what this is like. It's a Kennedy, and people are just bombarding him. And I just was standing back trying to figure out what the right approach was, what I was if I was going to do anything other than just observe. And then I saw him walk in the restroom alone. I mean, that's like an invitation to have a one-on-one discussion, right? So
Clearly.
and fortunately, us men have urinals, so we don't have a stall to yell through, you know. So I pull up an urinal next to him. Sorry to be so graphic, but this is how it all played out. And I said, "Hi, my name is Trent Loos, sixth generation United States farmer, and I am here to hold you accountable to the lies that you tell about my industry." And as you can imagine, in that environment, in that situation where everybody is just glad handing him, "Oh, you're such a great American," blah blah blah, this kind of caught him off guard a bit. And so that was our first interaction. And he introduced me to Nicolette Hahn at that time, who was running the Waterkeepers Alliance. And then I decided, I took it upon myself that I'm just going to keep track of where he's at. And when he speaks, I'm going to be there in the front row. And so for the next 8 consecutive weeks, I had interaction with Bobby Kennedy. And by the time we got to Oklahoma City at the University of Oklahoma, he was speaking. I was sitting in the front row. He started introducing me as Trent Loos, a sixth generation farmer who's been hired by the mafia to follow him around and intimidate him. And we had this real dog and pony show that was all over the country, from Santa Rosa, California to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. I just simply kept track of where he was at, and I didn't do anything other than let him know I was going to be there. And I recorded the lies that he was telling people about animal agriculture. And so couple of years we had this thing, and what he was really doing was he was trying to build a class action lawsuit against the big players in the pork industry, the Smithfields of the world, who at that time was not owned by Hong Kong or a WH group like it is today. It was owned by Joseph Luter and investors, so it was a completely different animal, but it's the largest pork production system in the country. And he lost that class action lawsuit. He did not win. And things kind of faded, and then we had a couple interactions just in strange places. I was speaking in Pennsylvania one day a couple of years later, and somebody told me that he was there speaking at Bucknell College, and so I went just to kind of, relive old times. And we had a little interaction at that moment. And we never had any interaction from about 2006 or 7 until 2020. And a friend of mine, a medical doctor, said, Trent, you really need to talk to Bobby Kennedy. I said, I don't think that's going to go well. No, no, you guys are on the same page on a lot of stuff. I don't think, Ted, I don't think that's going to go well. So it ended up, he sent me his email and I sent him a note because we're on the same page today with vaccinations. We're on the same page with
Mm.
health as it involves what the general public is being lied to about the true medical profession. And as many friends and family and loved ones as I've had in the medical profession, it's just taken a completely different turn. And Bobby's always been very steadfast in that. He's always been anti-vaccination. He's always been too much medical intervention, too much corruption, too many deals made in the back room. Which, by the way, in the early 2000s, I thought only the left side of the equation made those deals. Now I know better. I know that left or right, we got a serious problem. So I wrote out an email and I sent it to him, and he got back to me right away. And he said, and the funny thing is that spiritual wars like we're in today create strange friends who work together on projects. And so we started talking, and then I invited him to come on a couple of broadcasts. He came on a couple of broadcasts. When he started campaigning, he and his campaign crew actually would get into a situation where they needed agricultural advice. They would call me in Iowa when he needed a certain number of people to show up at a caucus in order that he would be the independent candidate. He called me and asked me to do an interview because he knew I have the agricultural and rural community that I can tap into. And so in 20 years, we got this whole strange dichotomy where we're adversarial, and now we've got some things we agree on. And what you're talking about is it should be a concern to everyone, which, by the way, I don't believe he'll be the Secretary of Agriculture in any way, shape, or form, if that's what you're alluding to. But he has this notion that big agriculture in any way, shape, or form is bad. You have to define big agriculture because we have to feed 8 billion people on the planet, which is ultimately what they're trying to do is depopulate the planet. I understand all of that. But just because we have large entities in agriculture, it doesn't mean they're automatically bad. If you're working at improving culture, if you're working at improving soil health, if you're working at improving the wholesomeness, the safety of the food is produced, I don't care if you have 2 cows or 20,000 cows, you can get that done. It comes back to the individual management and preferences. And he's pursuing things like we don't need fertilizer. He's too close on some of the net carbon zero issues that I completely disagree with. The interesting thing about all of this, as much as we come together on the medical front, I have spent every day of my life for the last 3 years, Chrissy, fighting the CO2 pipelines in Nebraska, South Dakota, Iowa, and North Dakota. And he's been one of the great vocal champions against the CO2 pipeline, this boondoggle, which is going to break America and most importantly, put the people on the path of this pipeline in grave danger. And he just 2 weeks ago did a video about the dangers of the CO2 pipeline. So it's such an interesting relationship that we've had where there are some things that we can come together and have a great agreement and discussion about, and other things that we just agree to disagree.
And I love that, that we've had so much division, especially over the last 4 years. And then if you've been in agriculture, it's been 10, 15 years of, lies and division and marketing. Of course, I'm in marketing, so I can talk bad of marketers, but marketing has played a huge role in these lies in agriculture. And so I think that just gives me a lot of hope that if we could move to a place where, yeah, we don't agree on everything, but we can have that conversation now. I think that's really helpful. And I would love for the days of treating politics like a football game where you have your jersey, and that's that's the only team you can root for. We have to start asking questions and challenging everything. And yeah, so that really gives me a lot of hope. What you're saying there. Uh, I know something that has come up a few times in my recent conversations is the Sustains Act, right? And
Hmm.
the great Mindy Patterson has done a ton of research and has really been sharing that research with everyone, and about the power that will move to Ag Secretary if all of their dream list comes true. And this is all instated. So I think that's where a lot of people are getting a little bit nervous about him standing in front of USDA with his activist roots. So why do you say that we shouldn't, is it that we don't have to worry about that, or is it that he's going to
He's
have
not going to be
other
involved with the
things?
Department of Agriculture. I'm very convinced of that.
Yeah.
The Sustains Act is a horrible thing, and Mindy does fantastic work. In fact, I had her on my broadcast about that early on. The truth of the matter is that we've been doing public-private partnerships for a long time, and they've created such, the word of the day, boondoggle for those of us that want to maintain property rights. And for example, Nature's Conservancy is wonderful at coming in, acquiring an easement, whether that be a wildlife easement, a riparian area easement, whatever the case may be, ends up control. When you have somebody sign an easement for you on your land, you've just given control of that land most of the time for perpetuity to somebody else. Despite the fact that you're going to continue to pay the mortgage, you're going to continue to pay the property tax, you then have to call somebody else and ask them if you can build a shed on your property. That it flies in the face of what made America what it is today in terms of the resource producing nation that produces the essentials of life for mankind. And then you have that third part entity that comes in, and there every single time, Chrissy, there's a relationship between, let's say, the Department of Wildlife and Nature Conservancy, and all of a sudden, the federal government achieves the control of this land that you thought you were working with a third party. That is, in a nutshell, is what the Sustains Act does, and it puts it all on a fast track. Because what we see happening, and it's interesting that you and I are having this discussion today because this morning on my Across the Pond segment, I had Layla McDougall from Victoria, Australia on. And she was walking through how they're building these wind development centers in Australia and Victoria. Now they want to build transmission corridors in Victoria, and they want to take the land away from people and remove their right to use the land. And I said, all you need to do is open your eyes and see that this is a global agenda to remove land ownership from individuals and put it all collectively into the state, no different than the Bolshevik revolution that happened in Russia in 1920. And if you're a student of history, you see that these people are not creative in any way, shape, or form. They just do something that's already been done that we don't learn about and then try to make it work. And you have to take a stand on property rights. It's the Sustains Act, along with CO2 pipelines, along with wind, along with solar, along with transmission lines. At every level, remove our ability to use our land as we see fit. And when we continue to do that to where we don't control it, we've lost freedom.
Yeah. Oh, there's so much to unpack there. The that basic issue. This is why I say we have to stop treating it like football. We have to look at every single issue because unfortunately, I think a lot of us are becoming the useful idiots that are pushing this agenda along. In our industry because that's the way it always is. That's, and everybody wants to conserve land. Everybody wants to keep farmland in their families. But like you just said, the danger is there where now you're giving over your property forever in perpetuity. Like, really think about this, right? So
I used the
do
term
we?
useful idiots in a debate the other day against the two people I was debating. They didn't take it well, but they are useful idiots.
Well,
One
and
of
I
them,
think,
one of them's a state legislator, by the way.
yeah, no, that's fair then. I think
But
we have to start asking every single one of us, break down our walls and go, am I a useful idiot in this situation?
here's why we're where we are. In 2022, we saw a decrease. No, excuse me, let me start this over. In 2022 until I even made some notes for you, Chrissy, today. From 2022 to 2023, we saw a decrease of net farm revenue from 184 billion down to 146 billion. That was a decrease of 19.5% of net farm income. Now, when I talk about net farm income, that includes these conservation payments, that includes equip funding, that includes so many things. And then the USDA has just announced that we expect another 4.5% decrease in net farm income in 2024 because of decreased prices, particularly corn. We're seeing a decrease of of corn revenue of 20%. And so we know you don't have to be too awake to realize that the farm economy is in the tank, literally. And so what is happening is that we're continuing to push the farm revenue, the farm net profit to a level where people have their backs against the wall, and they have now been convinced because government officials are telling them the only chance you're going to save this and pass this on to the next generation is if you get one of these easements. We'll pay you. We'll pay you to put wind turbines up on this place. We're going to control it for the rest of your life, and so is Johnny's life and your Johnny's life. But at least you'll be able to still be here. So people are making these decisions. Your term, I love your term, useful idiots. Making these decisions to become useful idiots because they've been presented with what they believe is the only option for survival.
Yeah.
That was a calculated effort. And until we stop saying, well, I got to do this because my neighbor's going to, and if I do it, don't do it, my neighbor does, I'm going to be out of business. That's the problem. You got to take a stand and say, no, we're going to take care of this land. Oh, and by the way, while all of this is taking place, here's the biggest one challenge. 2% of the world's population lives in the United States. 2%. We have had a decrease in agricultural exports in the last 12 months to the tune of $2 billion. We've had an increase of agricultural imports by $8 billion. So we've decreased exports 2 billion, increased exports 8 billion. That's a $10 billion deficit in agriculture exports in just 12 months. And now the experts are predicting that by mid 2025, our agricultural deficit is going to be $45 billion. We have the resources, we have the infrastructure, we have everything we need to continue to be a food and fuel exporter to the world. We got to ask the question, why are we losing ground in this global marketplace? It's because people do not want us to continue to achieve in producing the essentials of life for the rest of the world.
Right. And so why? So why is this happening? Where is it coming from?
Oh, well, I could, come up with some long answer that didn't make it sound like I was a conspiracy kook, but the truth of the matter is they want to eliminate at least half of the people on the planet. In fact, I find this fascinating. I mentioned the animal rights community was what got me into media to begin with.
Mm.
People often talk about Klaus Schwab. They often talk about Bill Gates, and Bill Gates is anybody has seen a video that says we need to have 2 billion people on the planet, not 8 billion people. You know who the first person to ever publicly utter that we need to depopulate the planet was? Chrissy, as intelligent as you are, and by the way, if I didn't study this obsessively, I wouldn't know the answer to this either. Do you know who the first person to utter that publicly was?
I have no idea.
Jane Goodall,
Oh,
the chimpanzee researcher from the jungles of Africa. And she came to a
wow.
press conference and said, we need to decrease the global population of people. And then all of a sudden, and that was I believe it was 91 or 92, all of a sudden we have these global leaders who are tyrants, not leaders, who latch onto that. And that's where we're at today. We continue because the same thing is happening in the UK, the same thing is happening in New Zealand, the same thing is happening in Australia. It's happening in all of these predominantly white Christian countries around the world. The rest of that probably ought to read Revelations, and you can find out why we are where we are.
Yeah, good advice. Very good advice. And it's funny,
Maybe start with Genesis, but if you don't have time for
right?
that, go to Revelations.
That's it. Yeah. Read Revelation and then start at Genesis and then figure it all out.
Yeah.
That's a good way to do it. Uh, but yeah, you hit the nail on the head for sure. Um, I think one of the issues is that they always make the packaging so appealing, right? As they're trying to sell these ideas, they make it, like you're a good person and you're saving your grandmother and you're um and now it's just so indoctrinated into people. I can hardly go on Facebook anymore. My daughter posted a picture of two chickens, one from the 1950s and one now, and the one now is huge. And people are like cursing a 18-year-old girl because of how horrible this is. I'm like, same difference between a Chihuahua and a Saint Bernard. It's selective breeding. Like, what are they thinking is
Absolutely.
going on? And we're at a place in agriculture where we can feed so many more people on such fewer resources in such little time and create healthy food for so many people. It just blows my mind that this indoctrination has taken such a firm grip on on everyday people who just won't think critically. So what do you think are some steps people can take to try to break down these walls? I know we always say, "Oh, we got to tell our story." Well, they got to want to hear you before they'll hear
Well,
your story.
yeah, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. I know that very well. But I suggest if you want to get the first step, go find a fifth grade science book and get to the section about CO2 and see what CO2 is responsible for. CO2 is responsible for plant growth. And yet the entire world has been contrived into believing that we need to be net carbon zero. The human body is 18% carbon, which means at net carbon zero, we cease to exist. And so we're somehow now going to convince the world that we have to turn this tide of net carbon zero. Well, here's the biggest thing. All you need, just a basic, simple thing beyond plant growth, beyond fueling photosynthesis. Interesting to note that a greenhouse has twice the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere as we currently have in our atmosphere. So that must mean plants in a greenhouse have the ideal environment with twice the amount of CO2 that we have. And do you know what they make dry ice from? CO2, because CO2 is about 90 degrees below zero in its natural state when they're making this dry ice. Wait a minute. I thought we were removing CO2 from the atmosphere because it was causing global warming. No, CO2 is a cooling agent. So, how is it that we've been fed this line that somehow CO2, a cooling agent, is causing global warming? When you go to the fifth grade science room and you read the fifth grade science book about CO2, you're going to be so mad at yourself that you fell prey to this nonsense. You're going to start telling every person you see about CO2 and how important it is in the atmosphere where it's at.
Yeah, and I love hearing you speak all over the country about this issue. It's so important. I worked in the greenhouse industry for a long time, and we sold contraptions to make CO2 and create it and blow it into the greenhouse to feed the plants. So you've never heard of anybody trying to shut that industry down, right? And I think while I was, starting my career and working, I never heard any of that in school. And then all of a sudden people are talking about CO2. I'm like, I, I work with plants. They need CO2. Where did this come from? And tell me some of your insight into the follow the money trail that you've been down.
Well, the money always comes back to the individuals in the Bank of London and the Bank of London, you can't talk about this without mentioning the Rothschilds and their desire to control everything, including establishing the country of Israel in 1947. But just last week, I had Dr. Ned Nikolov on my Trent Loos program, who is a climate scientist and he studied the actual data that the International Panel on Climate Change and NASA and everybody else is talking about for CO2. He said the data itself doesn't even say that CO2 is responsible for warming. It is, here's how stupid this all gets. It is the fact that we have less cloud cover over Earth than we have now. And there is a slight increase, according to Dr. Ned Nicola, of the global temperatures, but we have less cloud cover than we've ever had before. So Bill Gates, who is in the middle of every situation when it comes to depopulation of the Earth, has been funding creating this sulfur cover that would be in between the sun and Earth. Now, what's so strange about and the reason is that it decreases the amount of sunlight that gets to Earth, which is going to decrease the temperature. What's the strangest thing about this? What did the United States government do in 2006? They created a low sulfur diesel fuel and said you could not have over X number of particles per million of sulfur in your diesel fuel or you can't sell it, the ultra low sulfur diesel fuel. Why'd they do that? Because sulfur was causing problems in the atmosphere. And now here we are 20 years later, and we have people talking about funding, creating a layer of sulfur between Earth and the sun. Even worse, sulfur is vitally important for soil health. I have only met one farmer in the last 20 years that tells me that they don't today add sulfur to the fertilizer mix when they never used to have to do this until the EPA takes sulfur out of the diesel fuel, which removes it from, for example, coal-fired power plants have reduced their sulfur emissions by 92% since 1989. And now our soils are sulfur deficient. It's kind of funny, Chrissy, how God seemed to have made all of these things to work in a certain way. We come along thinking that we can tell people we're thinking we're improving them, when in fact we create a grave danger. We just need to let nature take its course and learn how to manage within that nature event.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Can you explain the plan for the carbon pipeline? Like technically, where is it going? Where is it coming? A lot of people in the East haven't really even heard of it. I know that everybody out West is talking about it.
So we currently have 5,200 miles of CO2 pipeline. And the reason that CO2 is in the pipeline to begin with is that there are 17 viable commercial uses for CO2. Most people who drive on a daily basis have some advantage of CO2 because if you go into a gas station and you get a carbonized soda pop, or if you go to the bar and get a beer, you're at some level reaping the rewards of CO2 in a canister. By the way, as a little footnote, 100 people in the United States each year die from mishandling of the CO2 canisters in bars, restaurants, or cafes because they are compressed and they're very explosive. So keep that in mind. Dry ice is another one of those CO2 uses that I mentioned. Another CO2 advantage is if you take CO2 and blend it with 50% natural gas and you go into either the Bakken or the Permian Basin or any place where we're fracking and doing oil recovery, you can increase the amount of recovered oil by between 15 and 18% if you have that blend of CO2 and natural gas at 50-50. And so they originally say the original plan, which was mostly a lie too, is that they're going to take CO2 from ethanol plants and coal-fired power plants in Illinois, Iowa, a little bit of Minnesota, a little bit of Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, and they're going to put it in the ground under the Bakken oil where the oil reserves are, where the pore space is, and the pore space is where natural gas or oil once existed in this formation. They're going to put it a mile and a half deep under the earth. That's not good because I've already mentioned the dangers of compressed CO2. August of 2023, Cornell University releases a study that says, oh, turns out that CO2 is responsible for volcanoes. We didn't know that. It's CO2 coming through the Earth's crust that causes a volcano. So why would we take CO2 from ethanol plants and coal-fired power plants and put it a mile and a half deep under Earth when we know that it's responsible for volcanoes? Nobody can answer that question yet.
Mhm.
But here's what they've been talking about doing in the states that I mentioned: 2,300 miles of a CO2 pipeline, in some cases 12 inches, some cases as big as 24 inches. And they want to compress the CO2 to a 2,200 pounds per square inch, so PSI. At 1,070 pounds per square inch, CO2 is still a gas. At above 1,100 psi and at 32 to 80 degrees, CO2 in a compressed pipe is a liquid and it will flow. And so what they want to do is capture the CO2 from these plants. They want to cool it because coming out of the steam is hot. They got to cool it. They got to get it down, and then they have a machine to compress it to get it at a very high compression rate. They put it in the pipeline, they send it down the pipeline. Interesting to note that almost every single plant, they have a prediction that it will take a third of the energy that is produced in that plant to cool and to compress the CO2 to get it in the pipeline. So if it's an ethanol plant or if it's Coal Creek power plant in North Dakota, they have to take a third of the electricity that they produce from this coal-fired power plant to compress and cool the CO2 to get it in a pipeline to send it. And what they say is to bury it because we've got to get it out of the atmosphere. That was the original purpose, Chrissy's. We got to get this out of the atmosphere. Well, South Dakota Supreme Court said that in no way, shape, or form do we see CO2 as a public use. This is clearly for private gain. And so eminent domain within the state of South Dakota cannot be used. And just last week, we saw an appeal, which was again denied by the South Dakota Supreme Court, that said this is not for public use, that you must go to a lower court if you want to make this argument again. So I
Wow.
mentioned there's been 5,200 miles of CO2 pipeline for some time. One place from Beulah, North Dakota into Saskatchewan, where they've been using it for enhanced oil recovery, but that's not a supercritical pipeline, which means it's below 1070 in PSI, and does not have the inherent risk like the pipeline did in Satartia, Mississippi, when it erupted. I believe that was 6 years ago, and we had first responders getting ill. We had people getting sick. And the other thing is that because I said that CO2 is a cooling agent, if it gets into the emergency vehicles like the fire truck, which it did, the ambulance, the fire truck in Sarsha, Mississippi, because they didn't know how to handle CO2. It's unlike anything else that's ever been in a pipeline. It is 1.5 times heavier than oxygen, so it seeks low areas, and it's just like a snake. It goes
Oh,
down the low areas and it just comes at you. And these firefighters went in thinking that they were going to take it out. And what happened was all the vehicles died and many of them ended up in the hospital. The other part that people need to remember is that the new packing plants for pork, turkey, and chicken use CO2 chambers to euthanize the animals. CO2 is an affixant if it is in too high of a percentage. At 7% of the atmosphere, they are euthanizing pigs, turkeys, and chickens. The plum model, the model that they look at, that if you live close to a CO2 pipeline, says that if you live within 3 miles of a pipeline compressed at 2,200 psi, you have less than 8 minutes to get out of the kill zone or you will be asphyxiated and die. That's just the
wow.
highlights on the CO2 pipeline. We have approval in Iowa, contingent upon South Dakota giving approval. South Dakota has not done that. And we have not gotten approval for a CO2 pipeline or this area in the pore space under Oliver and Mercer counties in North Dakota. So the other thing that you need to know, no matter where you're at, and you can think, well, I don't live in the Dakotas, it doesn't matter. The Department of Energy has released a model that by 2050, they want 90,000 miles of CO2 pipeline throughout the United States of America. If you don't believe that there is a model of depopulation, just look at what they have proposed for CO2 pipelines. And remember that CO2 chambers are how we kill pigs, turkeys, and chickens in the newest facilities.
Wow. So, how are they marketing this, or is it just money? Like,
Money,
how are they telling
100%
people,
money.
let's do this?
Um, We walked through it already. We talked
Hmm.
about the financial scenario. And
Yeah.
so then they come to you. They want an easement for the CO2 pipeline, which can be a quarter section. It might be a whole section. None of them are the same. And they're offering big money because it comes from the Inflation Reduction Act. I'll give you one other little bit of history that's very relevant. In 2008, under George W. Bush, they created the 45Q and the 45Z tax credits. Those were tax credits that were hanging out there for anything that may be perceived to be beneficial to the environment. During the Obama administration, they increased the amount of money that was available for 45Q and 45Z tax credits to $50 a metric ton. That wasn't enough money per metric ton to really make a difference. Donald Trump in December of 2020 signed the Use It Act, which was sponsored by legislators from Wyoming and North Dakota, again, thinking they were going to use the CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. And that made it possible to use, they called it the Use It Act, so that they made it possible to use the 45Q or 45Z tax credits for the CO2 pipeline. That still was at $50 a metric ton, and it didn't really make things happen until the Inflation Reduction Act went into effect. That moved the 45Q, 45Z tax credits to $85 per metric ton, and that took the lid off of it. And here's the other part of that. That is a direct subsidy, but it is a tax credit. It's not an outright payment. So you have to think about it. I've never been in a position where I need a tax credit. Who needs tax credits? Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Warren
Right.
Buffett last year, Berkshire Hathaway, they proudly talked about acquiring 35 million in tax credits just from their wind turbine development centers they had around the nation. So this is, at the end of the day, I could give you all the details, which I've probably given you way too many already, Chrissy, but at the end of the day, this is a transfer of wealth from the people on the land to a few who are these multimillionaires who need the tax credits. Let's not forget 7% of the global population. We know 7% of the global population emits over 70% of all emissions, period. So the 7% continues to bring about these tax credit initiatives from 45Q, 45Z, so that they can buy them and continue to be polluters while we, the peasants, are doing things that will not enable us to pass our land from one generation to the next.
Right. And so then this is where your hope can come from with RFK in the administration, because as you were saying before, he doesn't agree with this, right? What's
He's
his stand?
adamantly opposed and did a wonderful video about CO2 pipelines and the dangers just 2 weeks ago.
Oh, wow. That's good. I'll find that and put it in the show notes for anyone that wants to see it then. Yeah. So you're thinking we should ease our fears a little bit and about RFK and understand that we're in a time where we have to separate truth from fiction as well as we can and stand hard for the truth and oppose everything else. Is that what you're saying?
That is what I'm saying, but there's a part we haven't addressed that I just want to at least mention.
Hmm.
And in fact, I was asked this question last week by a USA Today reporter. How am I feeling about the presidential election and who am I going to vote for? And I said, I'm not paying attention to the presidential election. It's become irrelevant to me because we have had whatever president it is, including Donald Trump, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, all acquire more power as a president than the Constitution said they should have. The answer to these challenges is still the same for me at the local level. I can tell you all about what's going on with property tax and school boards. And school board, we can look at the CO2 pipelines, we can look at all of these challenges to our property rights, and some of them bring along dangers where people could die. But the property tax issue has become the number one issue for every landowner from state to state. And how does this happen? It happens through increased assessments, evaluations for what the property is worth. And that is, in the state of Nebraska, 72% of property tax goes to fund the public school system. Only 28% goes to fund, well, it's 24% funds the county government, with the balance being the fire department, the community college, all of these other things. My ability to continue to operate this land that Kelly and I bought and pass it on to the next generation is completely dependent upon what happens in Sherman County, Nebraska, not what happens in Washington, D.C. So it's more important for me to know who's on the school board, who the superintendent is, who the county commissioners are, and how I can control things at the local level. And then after that, I focus on what's happening at the state capitol. And so in that order, I really don't pay much attention to what's going on in the presidential election because it's all theatrics. In fact, I believe it was all predetermined quite some time ago. But I can have an input, and I have great enthusiasm of trying to nudge things at the political level in the local community, which is if our freedom is going to be maintained, it will happen in your county, not in Washington, D.C.
That is so well put. And yes, I 100% agree. I think we get so complacent in our communities. I couldn't tell you who the mayor is of Cape Coral, Florida. Yeah, so I definitely fail there. I look at big picture a lot, but you're totally right. The and I say this a lot actually, that if our the people that are running at the state level and then at the national level, they have to come from somewhere. And if we're not supporting the people at the beginning and the first steps and uh, and helping nurture them up through, then they are being funded by where the money is coming from. And that's who's nurturing them. And then we have these really crappy choices when it gets up to the top. So tie that in with what you just said is that really we do need to focus hard on our towns, our communities, and our state and our counties. So thank you for that.
Don't you love how every time we talk, you end up with a homework assignment?
Yes. I'm not joining the school board. The kids are almost out.
It's time, Chrissy. Join the school board.
I'll find somebody who'll do that.
You could find a delegate, or you could just do it yourself.
Yeah, I guess. Any closing remarks?
I was at a meeting in Enid, Oklahoma on Saturday night and assisting folks in Garfield County, Oklahoma fight an industrial solar complex. And I could tell in this audience before I started speaking that I had a high percentage of veterans in the audience, and it was clearly the highest percentage of veterans I've had in an audience for quite some time. And I asked them all to stand up, and I said thank you to them. But then after I said thank you to them, I said, I had a four-star general. I was never in the military, but I interviewed as many military men and women as I possibly can. Retired four-star General Jimmy Williams, United States Marine Corps, Arlington, Texas, September 21st, 2012. That's the guy and the day and the time. I remember it clearly because what he said impacted me forever. He said, stop giving lip service to the people who you're thanking for protecting your freedom. If you really want to say thank you to them, what you will do is exercise the rights that they have protected for you. So while we show appreciation and honor to those who have risked so much to protect our freedom, the greatest display of appreciation and honor is to go forward and utilize those amendments and every part of the U.S. Constitution that they took an oath to protect and they actually risked their life for. So my closing thoughts are, don't just think you appreciate what the men and women have done to enable us to live in the greatest nation in the world to call home. Do something different tomorrow than you did yesterday to continue to maintain that freedom and remind ourselves that we need to. God bless the veterans and the farmers who feed us.
That's beautiful. Very good way to close. Well, thank you, Trent, so much. Your wisdom and for all the work you do all across the country and your own community.
Hope I see you soon for the first
Yes.
time.
I know we've never actually met in person,
I
which is
know.
weird.
Let's make it happen.
Well, thank you so much. And thanks to all who are watching or listening. If you want to learn more, links are provided in the show notes. And don't forget to subscribe to North American Ag Spotlight on Rumble, Telegram channels, Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, Amazon, wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you like this episode, I would love it if you shared it. And have a great day.